Hey guys, it is now Wednesday, so I hope you're hanging in there. Thank you for participating in the lessons thus far and just kind of keeping an open mind that this is an opportunity to learn and to continue developing your skills and interests and following along with the text. I wanted to say a couple things. One, to keep the interest level going. Not that To Kill a Mockingbird isn't super interesting. I'll try to be mixing up a couple different things, but also I wanted to share on occasion a little bit of something from my previous life since I always get asked personal questions and I don't always have like the tools or the resources in class to kind of like share that with you. I'll be saving some of it to the end or putting it in the middle, not exactly sure. But just for a sneak peek, I'll be sharing like pictures. So, for instance, I went to China and I lived there for a while. And this is my very own picture of the street market where they sell animals, the live animal market. And this is where the coronavirus came from. So, I've been there. In fact, I think my second picture that I have to share with you is the shop where I bought a rabbit. So I didn't eat it. Someone asked me that the other day. Did you eat the rabbit? No, it was a pet, and I think I'll have to put that in another video. Um, yes, there's more to come at the end of this video. So let's go ahead and get started. Today we're going to be talking about chapters 14 through 18 of To Kill a Mockingbird. So I made a Prezi, kind of like I said, I'll be mixing it up so that we're not always just looking at PowerPoints. And there will be some that are YouTube videos, others are going to be links, so just hang in there. Today we're going to be talking about quite a few different elements of the text. Okay, so chapter 14. It continues the themes we've been discussing of knowledge, childhood, and maturity. Jem is growing, as you will see in this chapter and the following chapters. And Scout is also growing. She's asking more questions. And remember, we talked last video about how the way that children tend to grow up is by learning things. And I have a list of themes that appear in just a little bit of some of the things that childhood tends to preserve. And when those are violated, if you will, maybe prematurely, they say a child grows up quickly. But throughout the course of a child's or an individual's life, whether it happens prematurely or just in a natural state of growing awareness, knowledge tends to lead to maturity. And so, for instance, Scout asked the question, what's rape? And Atticus has to answer the question. And through that process, she's trying to put the pieces together of why is this such a big deal? Why is Atticus being threatened, assaulted? We're going to kind of see a little hint of that in this chapter. Further, Atticus says to her, you do as Calpurnia tells you. You do as I tell you, and as long as your aunt is in the house, you will do as she tells you. Understood? This happens after she asks, hey, can I go visit Calpurnia and stay with her house? And Alexandra says, absolutely not. Of course not. But Scout says, I didn't ask you. She's learning about authority figures and authority structures. In younger childhood, you kind of just take them for granted and you assume like, oh, these people are naturally an authority over me. As you grow to gain a little bit more of a sense of maturity and independence, you start recognizing that authority figures are in some ways oppressive or restrictive. And as far as a child is concerned, that cognition, that awareness doesn't really come as naturally. So later on, Jem says, stop causing problems with Calpurnia. And her feathers rose again. She says, Jem, you trying to tell me what to do too? So Scout is feeling a little frustrated that everyone is trying to tell her what to do. How is Jem growing? Well, he says to Scout, the problem is with this child, like, it is a big deal. Because she says, it's not a big deal. Why is Atticus so affected by it? Like, it only, people say things and then we move on. And Jem says, but with a child, you don't hold something in your mind for a long time. It's different with grown folks. So Jem begins to identify with the, quote, grown folks. And that's another difference between childhood and adulthood is that children tend not to dwell on things. Their capacity is to look at what's right in front of them and move on to the next thing. And some adults are able to preserve that tendency where if it's not in front of me, I'm not thinking about it. Other adults tend to over emphasize or mull on things for quite longer than they really ought to. Tying in a biblical principle here, that's why the Bible recommends that, well, no, it tells us like the meditation of your heart, the things that we dwell on and choose to put into our minds ought to be good and true and right and pure and just and worthy and excellent, because they are things that the more we dwell on, like what a man thinks, so he becomes. And so that's another kind of idiom that helps us to try to understand we ought to be putting in truth and goodness and light, because our tendency as growing, maturing adults is to not let something go. So there's the biblical integration there. But Jem identifies with an adult, and then he says, "You antagonize Auntie, and I'll spank you." So he takes on, instead of receiving authority, he begins to look for ways to assert his own authority, and that tends to happen as a person matures. His maddening superiority was unbearable these days. He didn't want to do anything but read and go off by himself. So he's trying to assert his will over everyone else. So we see that Dill had run away from Meridian, from his town, not from any bad situation. He makes up a story, not to get confused by that. He makes up this grand story that he was locked and chained in the basement. In reality, what he reveals later is just that his parents didn't have time for him. They didn't love him. They didn't invest in him. They bought him lots of things and just expected him to go play with them. And so he was neglected. And so neglect, we know now, is a form of abuse. And he was running from abuse, but just not the type that he had dramatized. So keep that in mind. His eyes flickered at Jem, because when he popped out from under the bed, Jem is like, "We have to tell Atticus." And he was like, "No, don't tell an adult." His eyes flickered at Jem, and Jem looked at the floor. But then he rose, and he broke the remaining code of our childhood. And so Jem leaves the pack, and it even says in the following chapter that he had grown too big for the treehouse. So at some point, we all depart from childhood. Chapter 15 begins in kind of a casual manner, but Scout says it was the beginning of something terrible. A lynch mob had formed in Macomb County in order to attempt to take the prisoner, Tom Robinson, and thoroughly abuse his body and hang him publicly. Atticus says, "That boy might go to the chair, but he's not going until the truth is told. And you know what the truth is." And so Atticus is determined to protect Tom Robinson oh my goodness, my phone. To protect Tom Robinson to the end, so that his story, that the truth can be seen. So again, that reinforces what we know about Atticus, that he is truthful and he is honest and he is just, and he will not allow anything to happen within his ability to Tom Robinson. So go Atticus. The problem here is that we have a limited point of view with Scout. Her questions are not answered. So she's going to ask, like, why are these men here, Dad? What are they trying to warn you about? Why are they all gathering around? And Atticus just kind of dismisses her, and Aunt Alexandra dismisses her, and Calpurnia dismisses her. And so we don't get to know, and we're left to read between the lines in the same way that she is. The only difference is that we know more, historically speaking, about what's going to happen. And Jem says, "I'm scared about Atticus. Somebody might hurt him." We don't see the depth and significance of the threats that are leveled at Atticus, or how this trial is truly affecting the family and the community and the culture. When the aunt is willing to say that you've ruined our entire family's reputation by defending him, this isn't something that is just like casually going over, even though in the book it is, because Scout isn't really affected by it. So keep that in mind, that our point of view as readers is really limited, and that's one of the criticisms that this book has seen, is that this isn't bringing awareness to anything, because Scout doesn't know anything. So that's a bit of a contradiction there. So Jem gets what Calpurnia calls the look-arounds, and he decides to, instead of going to bed and obeying, he packs up. He feels like there's something going on. And sure enough, the kids sneak downtown. Atticus is outside of the jail. Tom Robinson is inside of the jail. And a lynch mob forms. At first, the kids are hiding, but then when it looks like it's going to get aggressive, Scout says she pushed her way through the dark, smelly bodies and burst into a circle of light. And so you don't miss the allusions here to dark and light. Sort of, this is the right and wrong. These are symbolic terms, certainly. Atticus is actually standing literally in the light, and the rest of the people are in the dark because this happens at night. So on a literal level, all the way to symbolic, what it's just trying to show is that there is good and bad, right and wrong going on here. So Scout pushes through these men. She describes them as smelling of whiskey and pig pen. They're wearing overalls, button collars, hats. They have sullen-looking, sleepy eyes. They have a white forehead and sun-scorched face with heavy work shoes. These are farmers. And they're not your typical, like, city folk. They're not the people that she knows. I don't really have time right now to get into the significance of that, but again, they're not really educated, and it does go to show that those who were less educated did tend to be more prejudiced. Now, that's not to say that you couldn't have a very well-educated person who was prejudiced, and certainly most people were. However, they had enough sense and cultural awareness generally not to act on their prejudice. Whereas when you got the mobs together, it created a what's called a mob mentality, and it's a sense of object and a sense that you belong to something rather than still identifying as a person who is accountable for his or her own actions. So this is a mob, and Scout runs into the middle of the mob, and at first she's frightened because she doesn't identify anyone, but then she sees Mr. Cunningham, and she says, "Hey, Mr. Cunningham, I go to school with your son Walter. He's a good boy, a real nice boy. Tell him hey for me, won't you?" In response to that, the whole mob kind of stops. At first, they're threatening Atticus, "Get the kids out of here, and if you can't do it, we'll do it for you." But suddenly, they stop. And the dad bends down and he looks at Scout and he says, "I'll tell him you said, hey, little lady." And then he looks at everyone else. "Let's clear out." And they do. They leave. What does this show? That childhood must be left behind, connecting it to that previous chapter, but sometimes the innocence and civility of children is the only redeeming quality of humanity. What do we learn here? That children have an absence of fear. They have a belief in goodness. They preserve imagination that is bigger than the reality that is oftentimes harsh and negative. They have hope in the midst of defeat, and they represent the light and the darkness. So much more could be said about this chapter, but I'm just going to leave it at that. And I have a YouTube embedded that shows that particular scene that you can watch later. Because I will link this entire Prezi for you. Also, you can find on YouTube, just look up the movie and it has clips. I mean, it has the entire movie, so you can watch that if you'd like. Okay, chapter 16, I kind of summed it up with the term blind spots. At the beginning, they're all having breakfast. This is the morning after the lynch mob, and Atticus's life truly was threatened, as well as the children's lives. Again, we're limited in what we can understand of that significance simply because Scout doesn't get it. But she notes a subtle change in Atticus these days, a quiet digging in and a faint starchiness in his voice. So he's much less easygoing than he was, and he's more alert, aware, and stiff. Because it doesn't just happen with children. The more any person becomes exposed to knowledge of human evil, the more it does affect his or her outcome, temperament, personality, wariness, fear, all of that. And so Atticus is being affected. But in spite of that, even though his life was just threatened, he still says, "Mr. Cunningham is basically a good man. He just has his blind spots along with the rest of us, and it took an 8-year-old child to bring him to his senses. You children last night made Walter Cunningham stand in my shoes for a minute, and that was enough." Playing on that theme before that he talked about, you need to stand in another person's shoes or get inside of his skin to truly understand him. He says a mob is always made up of people, no matter what. Mr. Cunningham was part of that mob last night, but he was still a man. Every mob in every little southern town is always made up of people, you know. Yes, it was the children that did make a difference here, but it was also identifying with or as a person rather than an object or a cause. And I talked about this just a second ago, that it's really wise and important to see people, as individuals, with hearts and lives and homes and histories and backgrounds, rather than reducing a person to what he projects himself to be on the outside. After all, that's the prejudice that everyone was